The last video in this module is going to look at the effects of strength training. We're going to stay relatively broad and talk about how this works, but we're still going to work through it in a relatively precise manner to tell you exactly what's happening in the muscles as we resistance train. The same principle as endurance training applies here in strength. Endurance, we were stressing the oxidative metabolism portion of the system and making it respond to that, whereas in strength training, we're of course stressing the force generating capacity of the muscle and causing it to respond. Right? That's the ultimate goal for most people, is to be able to get stronger by increasing the amount of force that they can do, that they can generate during weight lifting. Right? So there's two, at least, concepts theoretically that can increase the amount of force that we can produce. Right? As I mentioned earlier in the first video, is we can make our muscles bigger. The bigger the muscle, the more force it produces. This is why we use that specific force in order to normalize that earlier. The same applies here though. The idea, as you resistance train, you get bigger muscles, which we of course know happens, and those bigger muscles generate more force. The other potential option is to make more muscle fibers. So which is it, or is it both? Let's walk through them. So the first definition is hypertrophy. This is the classic exercise physiology response, is an increase in the size of muscle fibers. Right? What happens is it results from an increase in protein and new myofibrils. Simply put, we can put more actin and more myosin into the same muscle fiber, making it larger. The number of actin and myosin complexes that are able to be formed and cross bridges and power strokes that are able to happen in that cycle, the more force we can generate. Again, I want you to visualize that process that I've had you memorize, is the idea that, again, myosin is ratcheting actin forward. So if we add more ratchets and actin, we can pull harder and pull stronger. More of those proteins, of course, are then going to make them stronger. But, of course, the opposite, of course, along with not only having more in there, the more you have, the bigger the muscle has to be. So we have much larger fibers from that. One other thing that I'll point out is when we talked about muscle fibers, the kind of structure of them, we highlight the idea of each nucleus being kind of responsible for a certain area of the myofiber. Right? So what we believe is that whenever we start to grow, right, the amount of area that those nuclei must cover gets bigger and bigger, and ultimately we need new nuclei in order to be able to control those. So the idea is that we add more myonuclei coming from our satellite cells. So our satellite cells provide the nucleus in there in order to support the increase in muscle fiber size. I'll say this, that this is actually controversial in the literature now. Back when I was in school and even into the mid to late 2000s, up until like 2010, everyone believed that this was the case, is that we needed more nuclei in order to support growth. What we've now seen is that in mice, they can actually use a special genetic tool in order to knock out the ability of satellite cells to add new nuclei. They kind of do a really high stress or overload on the muscle in order to cause it to hypertrophy, and they see no problems in the muscle getting bigger whatsoever. The question still remains is, what's the difference between a mouse and a human, if there's any, and does it happen? For this class, though, again, I like to share what's going on in the literature and what's going on in current day. For this class, we're going to stick to this idea that when our muscles hypertrophy, we need more nuclei. I still think this is the predominant theory that prevails and that most people are teaching and believe occurs in humans. Mice, much different than humans, of course. So we're going to stick with when a muscle hypertrophies, satellite cells add more nuclei in order to keep that area in which each nuclei kind of controls itself to be about the same. So that's hypertrophy, bigger cell, more nuclei, more actin and myosin in order to generate more force. So the other concept that is a potential way that we can increase force production is to increase the number of fibers in a muscle, right? More fibers, more force that we can produce. The term that we use to describe this is known as hyperplasia. Again, an increase in muscle fibers. However, the occurrence of hyperplasia, or adding muscle fibers, is relatively controversial. in general, we can say in animals, we can see this happen, right? We have the scientific tools. We can do really innovative genetic manipulation of these in order to alter muscle fibers and see when a new one comes about and where it came from, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, that's really difficult, I would say impossible to do in a human. So we have no idea. Again, as we talked about previously, getting studies in some of these major elite competitors who are strength training where this is probably going on, or possibly going on, more likely to happen in those guys than a normal trained individual, that in this situation, it's difficult to we fall into all those same traps again of getting samples, following them longitudinally, and being able to understand what happens. I'll go ahead and just say, here's what we think, at least as far as the experts in exercise physiology and muscle physiology have essentially agreed upon, is that this probably doesn't contribute very heavily in humans into increased muscle force. Okay? We don't generate a lot of new fibers, at least not from resistance training. Okay? So again, controversial, most people will side on the probably doesn't happen. So the way I want you to think about this is if I ask you any questions or any ideas of how exercise increases strength, et cetera, I want you to always essentially respond that hypertrophy is truly the answer, not hyperplasia. Okay? So then let's look at hypertrophy further. So where does hypertrophy happen? Like, where do we get stronger? So there's two options, right? We can kind of add sarcomeres, if you'll remember those basic functions, at the end of muscles, or we can intersperse them in between. Of course, if you think about this from a logical approach, the likelihood of this is that it's probably not going to happen at the ends, right? People who weight train, they don't have huge, bulging, large fibers at the ends of their muscles. Instead, they get large muscles in between. And that's exactly what this figure here accurately demonstrates, is that working from distal to middle to proximal of the muscle, right? So going from top to bottom of the muscle, kind of going down in serial sections. Each point is a different point. We can think of this as a bicep, right? So before and after, and we can see that we do get kind of hypertrophy almost everywhere except for the very ends. So we see hypertrophy the majority the length of the muscle. However, we see even more hypertrophy, of course, going in the middle of the muscle, suggesting that that's where we're adding more and more actin and myosin. So then let's look at what's happening in fiber types specifically. So if we look at fiber types, here I've just grouped them in this figure in their two major components, type 1 and type 2, because if we remember, force production in type 2 fibers in 2A and 2X are actually pretty similar. So we're going to lump them together. So type 1 here, shown in the far left, are yellow, and type 2 in blue, and then the average or mean in the purple next to it. Right? So if we look at pre and post and compare, we'll see that in our yellow fibers, we go from, about 4,000 micrometers, don't worry, you don't have to know that number specifically, to about maybe 4,500. So we do see an increase in the size of type 1 fibers. However, our type 2 fibers see a much greater level of hypertrophy. So we'll go anywhere from 6,000 to 7,500 or so. So again, much larger increase in type 2 fibers. So we can say and conclude that type 2 fibers see a much greater hypertrophic response to resistance training. The physiological question is, why does this happen? You should start to be thinking, how does this happen? Why does this happen? Why are our type 1 fibers not really adapting when our type 2 fibers are a whole lot? Well, here's why. So our type 1 fibers, we use them all the time, right? As we mentioned, they're fatigue resistant. So we're going to utilize them in most exercises or most daily activities that don't require a high force or high power output. Indeed, if you think about yourself today, how many times have you done forceful, all-out movements? I know for me personally, I don't think I've done a one in just daily living, right? We don't just do a lot of all-out, fast and forceful movements as we can, right? When we do, we're going to use our type 2 fibers, since for the most part, we're moving in relatively slow, controlled movements. in daily living, then our type 1 fibers get used all the time. One point that I'll make about muscle fibers is we don't have the ability to generate how much force they actually generate. We're going to learn this in the neuro section, but when a muscle contracts, it's going to generate the same amount of force. Right? So our muscle type 1 fibers are just going to generate the same amount of force every single time throughout the entire day as we just move and do different activities. Our type 2 fibers only used during intense, forceful, powerful movements. Again, not very often for most of us. Right? So if we then relate this back to the stress response to these muscle fibers to see an adaptation, what's going to happen? Our type 1 fibers, of course, they're getting stressed daily. Right? In every muscle movement that we use, we're likely using type 1 muscle fibers. Therefore, they are stressed and used every single part of the day. Therefore, their adaptation is much less. Type 2 fibers, rarely used. So they just hang around all day. So when we start to resistance train, when we do those high force, high power output forces, we then call upon these guys who haven't been doing anything. So of course, if we think about them from a stress level, that increases drastically, right? They now become extremely stressed and they adapt in response to that stress in order to handle those force productions even greater. Therefore, we see a greater capability of the muscle fibers, type 2A and type 2B or X fibers, to increase in size and force generation capacity over type 1 muscle fibers. We'll get through some specifics and then jump into one last idea of concurrent training here. So again, specifics are fast glycolytic fibers, potential to have a greater increase in size as compared to slow twitch, as we just explained. There's one other thing that I'll talk about, and this will become a big part of our neuro, but will lead into it here, is that when we increase in strength early on, that's preceded by hypertrophy. So you can say we need roughly 12 weeks or so, usually more, to see appreciable hypertrophy on the eye level. You can see it a little bit earlier with some specific measurements such as an MRI or something like that. But we need weeks in order to actually see hypertrophy take place. So if you're curious, most training studies doing hypertrophy need to be multiple weeks in advance, usually 3 or 4 months at a minimum. Right? And then, of course, long-term, we attribute resistance training to hypertrophy, not specifically hyperplasia. Although we can't rule it out, we still believe it's not a huge part. All right, so when we look at concurrent exercise training, so first let me explain what concurrent training is. The idea is that concurrent is doing both resistance and endurance training in general together or on the same day. And the question is, can we do both of these exercise training programs? So can you lift in the day and run in the evening, or run in the morning and lift in the afternoon, and still get the maximal response to the exercise that you would have if you were only doing one of them? As you can imagine, this is an important question, right? We don't want to waste workout sessions. And if you are an athlete, for example, who is a very competitive athlete, do you want to be doing either? So if you have a highly trained endurance runner, like, should they lift, or should it just be like, no, if you lift, your running is going to be compromised? So this is the idea of concurrent exercise, and this has become a much more larger focus in exercise physiology here in about the last 4 or 5 years. I'll say that our knowledge is still relatively limited. The main reason is scientists like me don't want to do these studies because they're a pain. In general, as we talked about, we need to do studies that are months long. Then there's all kinds of variables which could be difficult. Which one do you do first? How many hours do you do in between? What types of exercise? Controlling volume, etc., etc., etc. These are incredibly difficult and long studies to do. And when you have a grad student who wants to graduate, they don't want to spend 1.5 years training people to then ultimately look at the data and see what happens in multiple years down the road. So these are really difficult to find great studies out there, but they're getting there. So we've seen kind of a big boost in the literature here recently. I'll go ahead and just summarize what kind of the evidence-based practice of concurrent training is right now. First, we say that if you are doing both essentially on the same day, that strength and power may be compromised during endurance if using endurance training as well. Right? That's an important point. Strength and power even to a larger degree, may be more compromised than strength. Anaerobic performance or our glycolytic power movements, right, may also be decreased. So those kind of fit all in that same category. However, development of oxygen consumption or our aerobic capacity, right, our type 1 fibers, that does not seem to be affected at all by concurrent training, doing both at all. So therefore, we can say endurance capabilities not really diminished by strength training. So if you're an endurance athlete, you're fine to do both on the same day. If you're a strength training athlete, it may be better to somewhat minimize that. But endurance is still an important point, of course, of resistance training. So if you want to do both, how do you do them? The general recommendation now is to do endurance training in the afternoon or after your strength workout. And why is that? The main point is that in order to get strength gains, you need to be doing as much stress on those muscles as possible. The stress is ultimately the amount of volume that you can lift on that muscle, right? The greater the volume or the more weight you lift, the more stress you put on it. If you go running and then come into the gym and lift weights, the likelihood of you being tired and not getting as many reps or sets or weight that you were able to do before is diminished, right? So if you're already tired, it's not a good idea to then go in and lift weights because you're ultimately not going to be able to lift as much, get as strong, and see those benefits. So most people will say weight lift early, get those maximal benefits, and then if you are endurance training, do that later. Or of course, the best opportunity may be to find days in the week when you're only doing endurance training. Of course, that gets hard. If you are someone who's resistance training 6 days a week, there's not a lot of time in there for rest and recovery or endurance training. So if you have to, separate them by as much time as possible. Strength training always first, endurance training always after, because that will minimize the compromise that you'll have to make. That ends our lecture on essentially adaptation. So we talked about fiber types, we talked about endurance and resistance training. So that ends today's module, and we'll move into neuromuscular in the next section.